Good day. My name is Michael Swain. I'm the Executive Director of Freedom of Religion South Africa, and I'm here today with my colleague, Advocate Nadine Badenhorst, and we are here to give you a brief update and a report back on the experiences and the progress, if you like, that is being made in the whole regulation of religion matter. Now, as you may be aware, and if you're not, it's very important that you're watching this now, the CRL Rights Commission, which is an institution of state, is pushing forward with its agenda to regulate religion in South Africa. Importantly, we believe that they will in all likelihood succeed in this goal unless the church actively engages in the very issues which the CRL raised in their report, which they produced in 2016 entitled The Commercialization of Religion and the Abuse of People's Belief Systems. Now, to give you a brief overview and some background, this matter began in 2015 when the CRL, in response to certain complaints that it had received, subpoenaed some 85 religious leaders and organizations to appear before them, and they conducted an investigation. As a consequence of that investigation, they produced the aforementioned report, and in the report, very importantly, they made two major recommendations. Number one, that the CRL Rights Commission, which is an institution of state, should be given the power to license and thereby control religious practitioners and places of worship. And number two, the CRL should be given the power to be, in their report, to quote, the final arbiter of religion on page 48, and also have, again to quote, the final decision-making powers on page 47 about what or did not constitute acceptable practice. Now, this report then was put forward to the COGTA, the Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs Ministry Parliamentary Portfolio Committee, known as COGTA. And they held 2 full days of hearings, which is part of a normal democratic process. And at this process, and during this process, the vast majority of the submissions that were made by many senior religious leaders and organizations unanimously rejected the recommendations of the report. Obviously, they recognized, and everybody recognizes, that there were unacceptable abuses taking place, but they were only by a fringe minority under the guise of religious freedom. And you cannot disguise illegal acts and claim protection under freedom of religion. And secondly, that they unanimously said that many of these acts and many of these abuses that the CRL had recognized or highlighted were in fact criminal acts and therefore should be legitimately dealt with by the state, which obviously has a duty in that sense to respond wherever criminal acts are taking place, no matter who is committing them. And the further recommendations that they made was to basically say that the recommendations of the CRL were, number one, unnecessary because of the fact that almost all of them, in fact, all of the ones that they identified, were covered by existing laws, and therefore the state already had the power to deal with them. And secondly, unworkable, because clearly if you're going to license every religious practitioner in every place of worship, you're going to need to set up a vast bureaucracy. And if you cannot enforce existing laws, how are you going to be able to then regulate and have a whole other set of laws that also have to be enforced? And lastly, unconstitutional, because almost certainly in looking at whether or not practices particularly or what somebody's doing in their religion is acceptable or not, you're going to be looking at doctrine, and you therefore will be infringing, very importantly, their guaranteed Section 15 rights of religious freedom, conscience, and belief under the Constitution. Also, these submissions made by religious leaders called for an opportunity by the religious community and asked to be able to have a national religious conference or consultation to look at the issues and to then discuss solutions, which would, of course, be voluntary and self-regulatory by nature. In 2018, in February last year, COGTA then released its report on these hearings. And in the report, they unanimously rejected the recommendations proposed by the CRL to regulate religion. And instead, they said that there should be a national consultative conference to take place, and they also recommended that a code of conduct be developed, which would again highlight the responsibilities, both ethically and morally and legally, and in terms of compliance, that should be and must be expected from the religious community. But again, that would be a code of conduct to which the religious community would voluntarily subscribe. However, the CRL were not happy with this outcome, and they slammed the COGTA recommendations. And essentially, they said that they wanted to press on, and they declared that they intended to go to the Constitutional Court to get a ruling or a recommendation or a judgment, so to speak, that they were already, in fact, entitled to regulate the religious communities of South Africa according to their existing powers under statute and in the Constitution. Now let me hand over to Nadine for the next section.
So in April 2018, the Evangelical Association of South Africa, or TISA, took the initiative, and they organized a meeting which was attended by approximately 70 senior religious leaders in the country. And this meeting took place in Johannesburg. And at this meeting, the leaders present mandated the South African Council for the Protection and Promotion of Religious Rights and Freedoms to draft such a code of conduct for religion. Now, the reason why this council was selected for this task is because they had already authored the Charter for Religious Rights and Freedoms, which is effectively a document that sets out what the religious communities of South Africa understand the constitutional right to freedom of religion to mean for them. And this charter has already been adopted and signed by religious leaders across the faith spectrum, representing approximately 22 million people in South Africa. And so this charter really provides a reference point for now also developing the responsibility side of the rights to religious freedom that are already written into this charter. However, the CRL Rights Commission remained of the view that state intervention was essential. And they doubled down on their efforts after this, using the media, using public pressure, political connections, and even wavering segments of the religious community towards achieving this end. In September 2018, the CRL Rights Commission then, what they said was they're handing over this process of finding solutions to the religious community. And they in fact appointed Pastor Ray Macaulay in his capacity as the head of the National Religious Leaders Forum to convene a broad-based religious summit. And this summit was to be held at Rhema Church on 13 February 2019, and it was co-organized by the CRL and Pastor Ray Macaulay, with invitations sent out on the CRL's letterhead. Now, right from the beginning, 4SA and a number of other religious organizations expressed some concerns regarding the way in which the summit was called, some procedural concerns, particularly in relation to the lack of inclusivity that has earmarked some of the processes leading up to the summit, and the preparation of the agenda, which very clearly was an agenda that had been set by the CRL with the objectives that they wished to achieve. And this was particularly because the CRL stated that they would monitor the process closely to ensure that even at this religious summit, which was now convened for all the religious leaders in the country to find truly self-regulatory solutions, to ensure that the CRL's agenda would be adopted. And it was further reinforced when the CRL announced that a mere 10 days after the Rhema Summit, they would be having their own national consultative conference in terms of the Act, where they would set the agenda for the next CRL commissioners for the next 5 years. And they said that at that summit, they would adopt further resolutions affecting the entire religious community. So regardless of what happens at Rhema, that's what they would do 10 days later. Now, the Religious Leaders Summit took place at Rhema on 13 February, and it was attended by approximately 800 religious leaders from across the faith spectrum, from across the denominational and church spectrum in South Africa. And right from the beginning, it was clear that some people were unhappy about some of the processes leading up to the summit. Some of these procedural concerns were raised. And immediately it was also apparent that people were not happy with the agenda that had been set for the summit, and which clearly was a move towards adopting some of the recommendations that had already been made by the CRL in their report, and which importantly had already been rejected by the COGTA Parliamentary Portfolio Committee. Now, these concerns were reinforced when the CRL chair lady, Mrs. Toko Mkhwanazi Zaluva, said again at this meeting that the CRL are now handing over the process to the church, to the Religious Leaders Summit, but warned the meeting very clearly that if they did not on that day come up with solutions to address the abuses and malpractices that are happening in the religious sector, that government would intervene, and that the CRL would indeed, at the NCC, the National Consultative Conference of the CRL that was due to take place 10 days later, they would then decide for the religious community what would happen. And some of these proposals, which the CRL put forward, was, number one, a legal constitutional framework to put forward proposals for legislation, i.e. state or statutory regulation of religion, approval of a code of conduct unilaterally developed by the CRL, which totally ignored this draft that had already been developed by the South African Council for Religious Rights and Freedoms, and which had already been circulated in the religious community. And thirdly, an accountability system in the form of the establishment of umbrella bodies and peer review committees. Now, after some very robust discussion at the Rhema Summit, two very important outcomes. The summit firstly resolved that it was completely inappropriate for the CRL to dictate to the church how to solve its own problems, how to regulate its affairs, and that henceforth the CRL would be excluded from the processes regarding or the processes to find solutions for the abuses and malpractices. And so that the church would now take ownership itself to engage with one another and to find truly self-regulatory solutions by the religious community for the religious community. So the meeting resolved ultimately that state regulation of religion, as proposed by the CRL, was definitely not an option. And this again confirmed the recommendation of the COGTA Parliamentary Portfolio Committee, which also said state regulation of religion is not the way to go. Instead, what came out of the Rhema Summit was that a broad-based consultation process would now take place at local, provincial, and national level, where solutions would be developed, truly self-regulatory solutions, by the religious community for the religious community, and that would then culminate in a further 3-day summit in October 2019 to present findings and agree on proposals. So that was the Rhema Summit on 13 February. Now, as already said, 10 days later, the CRL held its National Consultative Conference, NCC, in terms of its statute, where it sets the agenda for the CRL Commission for the next 5 years. And at this conference, the chair lady, Mrs. Zaluva, and the CRL completely disregarded the outcomes of the Rhema meeting, and they called for the new parliaments, who will come into place after the elections, to empower the CRL to sort this thing out once for all. Now, the NCC, with very little representation from the religious community, we ourselves were present, but other than that, there were really only a handful of religious leaders present. They subsequently adopted a resolution that the CRL must continue ensuring that there is a peer review mechanism and advancing and promoting a process to control religious practitioners, and further to push for the proposals that the CRL has placed before the nation and parliament, which had already been rejected by COGTA and Rhema Summit, but nonetheless, the meeting adopted that they must go ahead and push for that. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague Michael now again to take us further.
So, following on from the NCC and the resolutions that were taken, there have been mixed messages. The first thing that happened, of course, was that we, 4SA, issued a statement where we expressed serious concern about the fact that the CRL had actually ignored the process that took place at the Religious Leaders Summit. They clearly should have taken that into account because as co-organizers of that event, and as those who even set the agenda of that event to a large extent, you would have expected them to have taken on board the resolutions, but they deliberately, for some reason, chose to ignore those. And they unilaterally called again for the regulation of religion and an increase of their own powers. The next thing that happened was that President Cyril Ramaphosa stepped into the mix. And at a meeting, he basically made the statement that the government will, quote, not go overboard and start regulating churches and religions because, as he put it, this could be considered unconstitutional to start regulating faith-based organizations, which is what we believe is certainly the correct position to take. However, shortly thereafter, the ANC, at an election briefing at the Thule House, said that they should have religious practices regulated. and that there should be a full-scale investigation to look at how controversial pastors run their churches, and that they should get the CRL involved to discuss what steps can be taken to put a stop to unscrupulous religious leaders. So therefore, as I said, mixed messages. And that is why particularly it is of vital importance that the religious community, and particularly the church, actively engage in these issues and discuss solutions and come up with proposals so that these situations can be dealt with but still remain truly self-regulatory and voluntary in nature. And for SA, we've been involved in this matter from the very beginning. And the reason we've been involved and the reason we're so passionate is because there is no greater threat to religious freedom than if the state comes in and regulates the religious community. We have also developed and given considerable thought to what possible solutions and proposals can be put forward to deal with the very issues that the CRL have highlighted, which, as we have said, are serious abuses, definitely, but not those which regulation of religion will in any way, shape, or form solve. For more information, and we really want to encourage you to take this further, you can look at our next video, which we're producing, which is called Proposals for Greater Levels of Voluntary and Self-Regulatory Accountability. And for a full explanation of these suggestions, view that video. And please, we also want to encourage you, get onto the 4SA website, www.4sa.org.za, and look at our Facebook page, Freedom of Religion SA, and keep yourselves informed, and let's get involved and take this further and find the very solutions that we need to resolve these issues so that we can remain truly voluntary and self-regulatory as a religious space in South Africa.